you're here. I apologize for my voice. I think I left it somewhere in Pittsburgh. I lost it last Friday, and somehow it hasn't come back. So we'll do with what we have, relying on the wonders of microphone technology. So what I wanted to talk about today is a project we have going on where students are building a game called Bonne Chance as part of a studio that we've called the App Farm. That's our little tagline, the App Farm, cultivating addictive learning behavior since 2015. Where we thought that stop playing. It would be, we'd look at the way students were designing games, and we thought that the skills that they were deploying and exhibiting could really map out nicely on the skills that we commonly understand to foster intercultural competence. So here is a quote from the Humanities Arcade that on the surface, the union of the humanities and video games might seem odd. The former focused on thoughtful reflection, context, and contingencies, and the latter on reflex, immediacy, and instantaneous feedback. In practice, however, this union is increasingly proving to be an enormously profound one, with games providing a platform for more experiential ways of engaging history, literature, philosophy, and even religion. So, one of the problems that we have is that we had a hard time making the students want to learn French, or any other language for that matter. And so we thought, what if we could make them learn to code, and that way we could let them learn French. And so we tried to reframe language pedagogy through the process of game design. So in other words, how can we turn this into that? Or how can we go from the wall, the design wall on the paper prototype on the left to the finished product on the right through human intervention. So why game design? So design thinking is generally considered as the ability to combine, empathy, creativity, and rationality. And so when you design games, you learn from peers, because you cannot, it's hard to design a game on your own, at least a big one. And so working together offers this sort of intangible satisfaction. It's interesting to work with people who do different work and look at it with different points of view, Biber says, so the final product becomes richer and more complex as a result. So you can tackle bigger problems in game. The other aspect that is interesting about design is that it's both a noun and a verb. It's both the process and the product, right? And so the more you keep on doing it, the more it reveals it has this sort of complex nature, dynamic, ever-changing. That's the ARC model of design: act, reflect, change, iterate. And so by bringing disciplines together, the participants can work on projects that spread beyond the boundaries of specific disciplines. And because projects are larger, you get to think with the clients, or in this case, we had two constituents really in terms of clients. We had us as foreign language teachers trying to put this in the classroom or as part of the curriculum, and then we had the students playing the games, right? So in this context, gaming provides the ability to reference the same artifacts through a variety of lenses, and so the students learn to ask their own questions. And that's one of the students actually wrote this on the board. The answers are just boring. Questions are what's interesting. And so they consider information as a resource to answer these questions and to be used for future reference in the design process. So as they are gathering information on their own, this sort of knowledge base that is going to be useful for the game, they also have to evaluate that information and see what they're going to keep and what they're going to throw away. They have to contextualize it, and so on and so forth. So the foundations, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea of where we're coming from in terms of our theoretical foundation, if you will. The bottom one is Julie and John. They're both in the room, so if you have questions, ask them. I don't know if you're familiar with the Studio H or Quest to Learn projects, but these are projects that very much do the same thing, this sort of learning by doing aspect. One aspect that I put the learner centered at the end because I was not convinced by the term at first, and I was really convinced by John and Julie's argument about why students need to construct knowledge that is around them and mediate it and construct media that matters to them. And it was so salient in the design process that rereading their book and seeing it in action, I was like, okay, I'm good. I'm going with the learner-centered idea there. This is the ICC, so I'm guessing I don't have to do the whole catechism of Michael Byram's model, right? We're all good with that. With the idea of preparing students to be flexible, adaptive, engage problems in their complexity, in their interpersonality, and so on and so forth. So here is the Bonne Chance project a little bit. So it's a computer-based game. The player, that's our welcome screen. The players in the game are, or it's one player, but they get hired by the French Secret Service, the DGSE, to pursue the resident villain who's been messing up the French time-space continuum by displacing historical objects. And so they have to, so it's like Jason Bourne meets like Peabody and Sherman, if you will. So they have to pursue this villain through major time periods and places in French history. So the game progresses through a series of problem-solving puzzles and tableaus, and then because there's time travel, they get handled a time travel device that is powered by, of course, as any self-respecting time travel device would be, French grammar and vocabulary. And so then they get to play these little mini games that reinforce the form, if you will, of the language. So this is an example of a sketch of a scene in Notre Dame, the cathedral, where that's the main character, her name is Elodie, and she gets to meet the priest. This is a list of the major, just to give you an idea of the context, the time periods that we chose and the places. As you see here, there's they're going to be in jail for a while at the end of, it's supposed to be, at least the way we envision it, is supposed to be like sort of a year-long thing. And at the end of semester 1, they get thrown in jail. They're in May '68 in the riots in Paris, and then they get picked up by the French police and put in so when they start the second semester, their first mission is to get out of jail, and then they can resume chasing the villain. We have to have a bit of a cliffhanger, or as my son says, a cliffhanger. No tea. So, and it goes, I mean, it obviously, this idea was to provide, if we're talking about intercultural learning, you have to have a rich context to couch it in, right? So this is the overall map of the game in its current configuration. It's always changing, so that's the sort of the golden path, if you will, the minimum amount of information players have to master to win. So then you have to assemble a team. And as you know from games, you only succeed if you have a team of players that are not all doing the same thing. So it's very much the same in game design. If you have all designers, then you're missing the French. If you have all French students, they don't know how to code. And if you have all coders, they don't know what to code. So that we have to build it this way, and it became very clear that the game design process was very akin to a game. I mean, the students were just gaming this thing to get it done, right? So this is what the design wall looks like, because they have to make the process both visible and salient. So it's color-coded, it's messy, but it goes back to what I was telling you about this idea of gathering knowledge, evaluating knowledge, organizing knowledge, and moving on. So that's what it looks like. This is an example of a little scene. You see it progresses like with text messages or where you have to pick the right culturally appropriate, so pragmatically appropriate answer, and then you move on. And that's our villain at the bottom left there. One thing that also became interesting is in this students' quest to this thirst for knowledge that they have is that they did all this research to make the game culturally relevant, and then they're like, well, we can't just let it go to waste. So they built it into the game, the knowledge, the pieces of knowledge that they thought was interesting. They actually built these, and so this is a screen shot from the game where, like, if you want to know more about Champagne, click here, and then you'll know more about Champagne, right? So, or with the World Fair or the Exposition Poster. And one thing that became also apparent when we showed the game to instructors is that they could see the possible bridges between the content of the game and things that they could do in the classroom. So, like using that poster as a sort of literacy-based activity, for example, and have students design more posters. So one of the ways in which this transformed the way we envision education is that the playing field is really flat. In the studio, this is where we are, everybody teaches and everybody learns. I've learned more through this than I ever thought imaginable. I witnessed many conversations between people who say, okay, I understand all the words and none of the meaning. So you're going to have to walk me through this one more time. And so that's where and we'll explore that a little bit more in a minute, the intercultural learning comes into play, because we have to learn to talk to each other. Just because we're here in North America with everybody speaking English doesn't mean that we can actually talk to each other in meaningful ways, and it's not a given, right? So the French students had to learn coding and design and asset management and so on and so forth. The coders had to learn design and French, and so these are some of the limitations that students have to balance. That pedagogical issues, what do fellow students need to learn? Technical issues, what can we figure out how to code? Gaming issues, what makes this fun? What makes them playable, replayable, and so on and so forth. And so as the problem became more and more interesting, the students would come into the studio outside of class. They spend 20 hours a week in this thing because their game was, we need to solve that problem, right? So these are some of the questions that came. And this idea is that to learn outside of your disciplinary culture. So up on the left is our two coders in the initial team who are learning. They're doing this sort of ad hoc tutorial in French from the French graduate student who was helping with the project. And I'll mind you, these are people who are in the project because they're trying to not learn French. That was their primary motivation. That's how we recruited them. And then at the bottom right, this is the same student who is explaining exactly the same thing to the next team, saying, okay, this is what we need to code, right? And this is why we need to code it this way, because the French language works in this particular way, right? So this is an example of how French students designed communication tools that would allow the designers and the coders to understand what they meant. So they had to figure out this little paper prototype, say, okay, this is what we want. Do you understand this now? And they said, sure. And then they coded it, right? So one of Byram's idea of the savoir comprendre, so this interpretation of new knowledge, I have to tell you, I was vehemently against time travel. I thought it was overused, badly done, and I got outvoted 12-1, and therefore time travel it is. But where it became really interesting is that the students said, no, Sébastien, we got you, we know what you, but this is what it's going to allow us to do. If we do time travel, then we can really, really contextualize this thing. So we're going to research things like the color palette of the Renaissance, the music of the 19th century, what people would have listened to, what they would have worn, what access to literacy they had, and so on and so forth. And then we're going to put that in the game, right? So that's their researching artwork and artistic production from these different time periods so that they could derive I didn't know there was a color palette to the Renaissance, did you? So, and so these are the elements that ended up into the game, the interface design, so that, and now mind you, I guarantee you that 95% of the players are not going to know this is the color palette of the Renaissance when they are in the Renaissance, you know. But the fact that they went to that level of detail to make sure that this was culturally appropriate tells you something about their motivation to build this thing. And so then we had to also run competitive audits about what would be commonly understood gaming experience, user experience, so that we could then choose what we were going to do. Just by the way, this font, and that's why I'm using my own computer this morning, is because I sent my file and I was like, yeah, that's not going to work because this font doesn't exist. The font was actually created by the students because during their research, they realized that French kids learned to write in cursive and that there was no font in the computer that was available to them that would be legible on the screen and approach the French cursive. And so they actually designed a font for the game. And that's this one. It's called Mr. Eves, right? Which is, Yves is like Yves Saint Laurent, right? So, so it's a play on that because they keep on calling it Eves. So it's E-A-V-E-S now. Anyway. So the students are conducting this research regarding the theme, the game mechanics, playtesting other games to determine the mechanics or drivers of fun. And then as they are doing all this research, they are highlighting what is important to them and what needs to get put in the game. So in other words, they're evaluating both their own learning experience, but also what other students will need to learn to sort of move along with French. So the students become the teachers, which is exactly what we want to do. So the studio becomes the student sandbox a little bit. So it offers a sort of safe space to practice designing, to practice learning French, where they're not going to become, too self-conscious, and they can ask difficult questions about culture, question their own culture without offending people or fear of terrible repercussions, except being laughed at, which is part of the game. And then the sort of instant, just-in-time information and feedback loops that are built into this process allow them to explore more ground, if you will, than in a linear, predetermined pace kind of model. So, in other words, which also mimics a game where you make hypothesis, you explore, you test, you fail, you generate a new hypothesis, repeat cycle. I don't know if we have time to watch this video. This is, I'll see if I can talk over it. This is the two students who are coding a sentence building game. And this is, I will say, this is one of the limitations of the project. That, this is tackling this sort of savoir-faire idea where they get to enact the knowledge, and then the enacting of the French knowledge is something that was still the language proper. The culture, they got it down pat. The actual language is still something that we're working on. But here they're building this thing, and they get frustrated because it keeps on giving them an error message. But it's the AI that's giving them the error message because they got the French. Right? So they say, okay, but that's what we should get because that's what the French answer would be, but we're not getting this. And at the end, it's like, I'm going to murder someone. But rest assured, nobody did lose their lives over this. So another aspect of a culture, as we are creating this new cultural system, is that it has to you have to be able to transmit it, and it has to be able to sustain itself, right? And so the students here, you can see the students on the left spent copious amount of time documenting the process, building tutorials for the next generation of students, and so that then here she's actually walking one of the incoming students who is currently working on the game through some of these tutorials because you couldn't get to where it was. So the students are also aware of the fact that they need to be able to transmit that knowledge that they have so that the next generation is not going to have to reinvent the fire, the wheel, and all kinds of other technology. So The other part that makes this project a little bit, is that you have to have the flexibility for the new students to come in and actually put their imprint on the game. So it needs to have that flexibility built in. But so this is where it started. There was 3 of us talking about it, and then we got some more students, and then we got some more students, and now we're getting to a point where I'm no longer in the picture. The other 2 graduate students who started it are no longer in the picture, and yet the project keeps on. I mean, I still go back and forth, but the project keeps on going on the strength of its student members primarily, right? So assessment, because I know somebody's going to ask me a question about this. I'm a big believer in the fact that, like Jim G says, if we want to change education, we have to change the test, right? Because otherwise you teach to it. And so what is our assessment of this project is, how do we know that they learn what we want them to learn? Is because they are demonstrated in producing a culturally authentic, linguistically accurate, playable and replayable working game. So the proof is in the pudding. If they know the French, if the French is correct, if the culture is where it's supposed to be, then why do I have to say that they didn't learn, right? So in conclusion, game designers learn language and culture as a result of designing the game. The learning occurred organically through the design process. The language of the second language learning as a product of both the student interest and it allows us to organize the learning experience differently. And then, as I was telling you, the learning. So we do have evidence that we did actually do some testing on where the students were linguistically before they started the process and where they were linguistically just on the language itself at the end of it. And so, of course, all of the language forms that were already in the game, they've learned. But then we need to build more, because otherwise it's too narrow a scope to amount at this point to what would be commonly accepted as a first-year learning of French. But the funny thing is that they are learning, and they are aware of the fact that they are learning against their will. I was one of the student designers who was running me through a game that he had just finished and packaged, and I was like, man, you're doing this all right. She said, damn it, I'm learning French. Damn it, I'm learning French. As he was racing through the game. So regardless of their major, the students are learning, are learning through an analysis of the humanities, which is the subject matter. They're learning how to collaborate, develop, explore, refine content, which is design thinking. They're learning in an environment that mirrors the professional environment, which is the software development and the study to be a designer. And they share those results with their peer, which is the whole undergraduate research and dissemination idea. So I'm going to leave you with those words by Deborah Smith-Shank. The current teaching dynamic assumes that there is a correct body of knowledge for a teacher to communicate to students. In order to move away from the dominant hierarchical model, it is necessary to develop an entirely different framework. And I hope that you can see that this is what we're trying to do. But so building this ecology of learning that extends beyond the 4 walls of an institution and engages students in ways that are exciting, empowering, and culturally relevant. So this game was, as all games, collaboratively designed, and so we need to acknowledge all of the students and people who have worked on this. So this is it, growing an addiction to learning, or an addition to learning. That's a kind of interesting typo there. I'm going to have to go and think about that one. So anyway, thank you for your attention. I think we have a few minutes for questions.